When I first started at St Helen's on staff here, I was, I think, supposed to be an apprentice under the person that was looking after the missionaries and doing the international student work. And another guy was supposed to do the international student apprenticeship, and I was supposed to do the mission partner apprentice. But the guy above us left, and so we ended up doing his job and didn't get much training. So everything that's wrong here is due to our lack of training since 2001. But my predecessor, Angus, he subscribed to Evangelicals Missionary Quarterly, a journal that was written form, and the International Bulletin of Missionary Research. And in the International Bulletin of Missionary Research, it always began with someone's pilgrimage in mission, what they had learnt, nuggets of wisdom they were going to share. And this journal was utterly liberal and rather useless. Hopefully, some of the nuggets that are going to be in this will be more useful, hopefully. Thanks, Will. And all of it, I don't think, is rocket science at all. All of us, in some sense, are involved in mission through being here. Many church leaders from other churches, I've asked you what you're doing in your churches, and everybody is doing something, and that's great. But hopefully, we can help one another do a bit more from today, and we can learn from one another here as well. It's called Bible Matters, this session, so we should have a little bit of Bible. And that's what I have now, a little bit of Bible from Revelation chapter 7. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, "Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen." Revelation 7, after the letters to the churches that we often preach and teach through, after that great vision in chapters 4 and 5 of the throne room in heaven, showing that God is in charge, after chapter 6 of the seals of the scrolls being open, we come here to kind of one of the many cycles of culminations in Revelation. This great picture of multitudes around God's throne. If you ever want some mission talks on chapters 4 and 5 of Revelation, Henry has got a good couple that he's very welcome to come and do for weekends away and that kind of thing. But here in this passage, just these few verses, we see it's about peoples. Peoples from every nation, from all tribes, from all languages. It's about salvation. Salvation has come to these people, these multitudes. And it's salvation that belongs to God. The same words are on Jonah's lips in Jonah 2. It's all from God, by God, and for God. He's the one to get the praise for it, the glory of it. Probably all read something of John Piper's books. And his book on mission, I think, is still the best book in my mind. Let the Nations Be Glad. This is the least cheesy cover, and it's had about 3 or 4 in the last 30 years or so. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to. But it's all about how God's glory, this glorious vision and glorifying God, should inspire missions, should inspire people being sent and supported amongst the peoples. And that passage helps us to see that God's plan, the culmination of that plan, is to bring people into the kingdom of his Son. People from all nations, all backgrounds. Back in the day, the Great Commission, those last words of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, was a kind of the key touchstone for people to get involved in mission. It was very important in William Carey's mind, who I'll talk about in a minute or two. But throughout the 80s and 90s, really, people were trying to say, look, there's much more to mission than just one verse. It's not just an afterthought or just for a few particular people, but it's God's plan from the beginning to the end is all about the nations coming into his Son's kingdom. So much so that people like Chris Wright wrote The Mission of God, this hefty tome, much bigger than John Piper's. I think it's really good on God, really encouraging, inspiring on who God is. I think it's really bad on mission. He very much buys into mission isn't simply bringing people into the kingdom of the Son. It's about doing justice here and now. Justice is important, but it's about bringing people into the kingdom of the Son. That is what mission is about, as I'm sure you know from Kevin DeYoung's book, The Mission of the Church. Very helpful challenge to Chris Wright's stuff. So we have the Great Commission at the end of Matthew's Gospel. We have the big plan of God from Genesis through to Revelation. But actually we have no biblical mandate for saying that mission should happen in X place or Y location. It should happen everywhere. But where should we as St Helen's or as Euston or St Anne's Limehouse do it? The Bible doesn't say, which in many ways is thoroughly freeing. In many ways is quite scary, because it comes down, in a sense, to us, being dependent upon God, his guidance, praying, and going forwards. I find that pragmatism both liberating and quite scary. But hopefully that pragmatism means that we can encourage and help one another as we do this together. So that's something of the Bible. But what about where we are at St Helen's in London? How does that impact what and why we do? Obviously, this will be different for different churches in London and outside of London. But I think, first of all, history is important so that we can understand why we do what we do and the way we do it. A bit of a historical context, I think largely for English-speaking Protestants, if we're kind of being specific. In many ways, mission began for English-speaking Protestants in the late 18th century. With William Carey. In 1792, he wrote an inquiry into the obligation of Christians to use means for the conversion of heathens. I think my title's nearly as catchy as his. And he wrote that off the back of the Great Commission in Matthew 28, advocating that this verse was for all believers, not just for the apostolic age, not just for the apostles. The church that he was part of at the time said no, which is why he wrote it, and which is why he then went to India in 1793. But in this little tract, this inquiry as to why Christians should do stuff amongst the heathens, he divided the world up into Christians, pagans, Muslims, with a few papists thrown in for good measures, because he was a Protestant Baptist, obviously. And because the church had not been supportive of him at all in going, he set up the voluntary society, what we now know as mission agencies. The church wasn't willing, he was, and created a society around him to do that, which became the Baptist Missionary Society. And we have many other missionary societies today. So Selvin from Japanese Christian Link, Overseas Missionary Fellowship, OMF, Crosslinks, and the like. All coming from this kind of first vision because the church wasn't doing its job. Fast forward a few years, certainly, to 1910 and the Edinburgh Missionary Conference. A bunch largely of British but also American missionaries gathering to think about how to do mission in what was then the modern world for them. And they didn't divide the world up into Christians and pagans and Muslims and papists. They divided the world up into two. Christians in Christian lands and Christians in non-Christian lands, with the idea that you send from the former to the latter. People, Christians in Christian lands, go to other places where there might be Christians, but not enough, and the land as a whole is not Christian. You probably noticed that we're not in that world anymore. You probably noticed that there are Christians spread across the world. In almost all nation states, there are definitely Christians. In almost all people groups, there are probably Christians as well, to an extent. And so if we were to carry on the same kind of way of doing mission, of simply sending people from here to there, I think it's missed something of what has changed in the world. In the 1970s and 80s, missionary theorists, missiologists, theologians were very much thinking in these lines and showing that We'd become far too fixated on nation states, political countries, France, Belgium, Kenya, Britain, rather than people groups. If you look up the top of Revelation 7, from every nation, but then it's defined really from all tribes and peoples and languages. It's not political nation states, but it's people groups. It's the Maasai in Kenya. It's maybe the White East Ender in East London. Different people groups. And at that time too, you had much more emphasis on understanding of culture and people. And in many ways, I think the Bible took second place to people wanting to understand culture and people groups. That's helpful, but it made anthropology, social, cultural anthropology, the kind of foundation for all missionary endeavour. A bunch of grumpy white theologians, of which I was one, wrote a piece a few years ago trying to say what is good and bad about mission in the world. And this is one of the targets, that too much Western understanding of mission has been a result of anthropology rather than theology and a kind of science of missions. We're in the 21st century and it's a post-everything world, I would suggest. Post-colonial world. I, as a British person going to Sylhet in northeast Bangladesh, wasn't tremendously well received. I, as an Englishman, think my word is my bond. To the Sylheti people there, an Englishman cannot be trusted. If you look back since 1792 and William Carey arrived in Bengal, the Englishman's word has been broken repeatedly. So when you speak the word of truth, the gospel, it might not always be received particularly well. We're in a post-communist world. Fall of the Berlin Wall and the communist regimes led to massive amounts of missionary activity in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia, both for good and for ill. I remember my first lecture at university, which was in social anthropology, by a very depressed Marxist. Because the Berlin Wall had fallen, his whole world had fallen apart. Most Marxists are depressed anyway, and he was even more depressed. And what makes him even more depressed was he said, back in the early 90s, that the only two ideologies left in the world were fundamentalist Islam and fundamentalist Christianity. That was quite interesting. He's still pretty depressed, 30 years on, 40 years on, whenever. We're also in a post-9/11 world. Some missions, sending people amongst Muslim people, have struggled since 9/11. Not for want of people to serve amongst Muslim people, but for want of support behind them. One friend has said that when he went raising money, people would prefer to vote for put money into a political party that will put boots on the ground in the Middle East rather than missionaries on the ground to bring them Jesus' good news. We also live in a post-Western world, I would suggest. The rise of China and soon the rise of India means that we need to think about how we do mission differently as a result there. The gospel certainly spread under the British Empire as it did under the Roman Empire and as it has done in the 20th century under the American Empire. Will it do so under the Chinese Empire? We hope so and can pray so. And in Britain, we live in a post-Brexit world, which, whatever one thinks of Boris and Brexit, and I won't say any more, it certainly made mission in Europe from here a lot harder, which is annoying. So there are Christians in many countries, amongst many people groups. It's hard for someone who looks like me sometimes to be sent to particular places. But Revelation 7 is still true. Matthew 28 is still true. So how might we be involved amongst the nations? Well, it might not be best for us to send people to work amongst Somalians, for example. It might be better for Kenyans to do that, or to train Somalians in Tower Hamlets to go and do it. And we must grasp this here at St Helen's and whichever church you're part of or go on to lead. So something of a historical context. What about a local context for here at St Helens? Now, if you're not at St Helens or aren't going to stay at St Helens, please keep listening, just so that you can think about how you can understand your own church context and what impact that would have on how you send and support people. So at St Helens, we tend to have short generations of people. What do I mean by that? People don't always stay around for years and years, from the cradle to the grave. Maybe 3 to 5 years in the evening congregation. We obviously want people to stay longer, but that's often the case. Sometimes in the morning, maybe 5 to 10 years. And yet it can take time for mission partners to be useful. If you send someone to Japan, say, and they don't know any Japanese, it will take them a while to learn Japanese, maybe 5 years to begin to get effective. Supposing they were sent from a Sunday evening congregation at St Helens, by the time they begin to get effective, many of the people that sent them are no longer here. St Helens is a big church with a series of congregations. Not everybody will know everybody that we send, personally, deeply. The church I grew up in, which was a Baptist church, and so liked to own William Carey very much, even though I'd often lost his gospel. I think everybody there did know our missionaries. We were small enough to do that. But it's not the case at St Helens. So in view of all those things, we've decided to, in one sense, limit the number of people we send as missionaries, as people that we formally support for a number of years in a different cultural context. Now, All Souls do things very differently. When I first started here, we had around 15 missionaries. All Souls had about 50 or 60. Different churches can do different things, and that's fine. But we've decided to do it this way. And particularly to help us as a church to focus on mission, to actually be focused, and to have a few areas that maybe we can understand a little bit more about in detail, and so maybe be a little bit more useful when people get sent there and arrive there. And hopefully, everyone in the church can know something about that area without knowing everything about the person we've sent, but can understand the area and can support the people there as a result. So short generations leading to a small number of mission partners in focused locations. On the whole, I don't think we're bad at Bible teaching. And so in view of that, I think it's appropriate that we help others to teach the Bible. We want to help others do exposition well. That kind of began because of who we are, but also seeing people come to us and then go out and want to maintain some kind of links. For example, the Latvian churches and Christians that we know well. But also we want to make that bigger and much more of a focus in what we are doing. Certainly in the run-up to 2030, we were putting together various things that we want to do. And this is one of them, to establish expository centres in different parts of the world. This is something we think we can do and encourage to make happen. We are, geographically at least, close to Europe. And certainly we were, geographically at least, close to French-speaking Europe. I said earlier that it can take some time for a missionary to be effective if they're having to learn the language. Well, many of us learnt French at school. And even if it was GCSE or A-level, it's more than nothing. And so you can begin to hit the ground running a little bit earlier in France or Belgium, for example. So we did focus on French-speaking Europe. But also, French-speaking Europe, geographically close, Paris, the city area of Paris linked with the city area here, people were able to move their jobs when we were part of the EU much more easily, to join churches, not in a formal mission capacity, but as regular church members who could encourage other regular church members to get involved. So we were close to French-speaking Europe. We were part of the EU. But even as that is happening, we've seen people come to us at St Helens and think it's time to widen our focus beyond French-speaking Europe. Maybe that's because of, again, city centres like Frankfurt, or people coming to us who have particular interests in particular countries and people groups that would be worth investing in, be that Italy or somewhere else. We do receive people from elsewhere. Not simply congregation members, people that might have moved their jobs when they could from the EU or have come from Australia or America, but also we receive people as apprentices here. Many of you here will have come from a different country, a different people group. And we want to support these kinds of people going back to their home countries, to encourage them in their outreach and to set up expository Bible centres as well. And that's what we've called regional partners rather than mission partners. And I'll talk about them over the sheet. And we're also obviously in London. We don't need to go anywhere to do mission. We don't need to go anywhere to be involved in other people groups, in other ethnic groups, tribes, languages. We don't need to think that staying here is second best when there are Sylheti Bangladeshis on our doorstep and many, many others as well. And it's interesting how God works as well, from little things to much bigger things. So 20 years ago, there was probably 2 tables stuck together of Chinese PhD students. Look where things are now with a 2 p.m. congregation and links into China and beyond. How God does build things that you aren't expecting necessarily. Our focus areas where we sent people, to begin with, was French-speaking Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Muslim people in Bangladesh, and then a kind of anyone else we might be willing to support, catch-all. China wasn't there at all, but what God has done. And also raised up other people for East Asia, as we'll see over the page as well. Also, being London, global cities become something that we can do, living in a global city. And that's something we're keen to encourage as well. Ministry and mission in places like Singapore or Frankfurt or others where we can do the same kinds of mission and ministry as we do here. Not to do it all exactly the same, because it is a different context, but to link up in some way. So that's something of our local context. But what about actually sending and supporting people from here? We want to send 938 type people. All you guys here. People who are gifted and godly. People that we'd want on staff. And it's been great that team leaders at St Helens have taken responsibility for this. That ultimately, they want it. If we're going to send a missionary, that has to be part of a conversation as to whether we're going to have another student worker. We want to see them as equals in that way, not just shipping off overseas, people who might be awkward and don't quite fit with what we're doing here. If you look at the sending words, a couple of words in Greek in the New Testament, it's usually sending people either to strengthen churches, like Timothy, or to bring the gospel to unchurched areas like Paul. There's obviously more times where someone is sent to pick up a donkey, that kind of thing. But when it's kind of a more theological, it's sending Timothy's, it's sending Paul's, is what's going on. I think we tend to send Timothy's rather than Paul's at St Helens. Now, in one sense, that's probably always going to be the case. I think Paul is probably more unique. I know you can't be more unique, but more unique than Timothy in many of the ways. But I think we're good at sending people that can teach the Bible in other churches and strengthen them and help them to plant churches. I'm not sure we're so good at sending Pauls that can go into unchurched areas where the gospel has not been preached. 9 Marks has got something, just a very brief little thing and a few links on there that's helpful to look at as to who they send and why. In terms of supporting mission, I think we do it very well from the front on a Sunday. often illustrations in sermons, always prayed for mission partners in the service. There's always a slot in the prayer supper for that. I think we have lots of upfront sending and support. When mission partners come back on home assignment, they're normally given a slot to share what they're doing. I'm not sure we're so good at helping small groups and individuals be supportive of our mission partners. And that's partly because lots of things need to happen on a small group evening, and it often gets squeezed out with those lots of things. I think we're not always good at talking about it one-to-one either. I think where it is really encouraging to see is amongst the children with their very important prayer person they look at every so often, and often have a mission partner come back and speak with them. And the same with the youth group is really encouraging. But recognizing that that is the case, we also have what I'm sure you other churches and most other churches have a missions committee, or we call it the international committee, of people that are particularly linked with each mission partner, that can read between the prayer letter lines as to what's actually going on in their lives and keeps in contact with them, ideally at least once a month. And then we as a committee meet every other month to feedback with one another, to take advice where that needs to be, to pass on advice to a mission partner. And then because the people linked with each mission partner are busy people too, and don't always do that because it's hard to do, we have a couple of backstops. They can keep in touch with the mission partner too. Me and Anna and Mark Crossley as well. There are some top tips from Surge, which is an American-based mission on how to support and care for your missionary. It's really helpful. Some very obvious, but encourages you to do it nonetheless. One thing that I hadn't thought of there, it says, allow for the tension between sacrifice and sustainability. It's probably something that all of us need to know in ministry regardless. Allowing for the tension between sacrificial service and sustainability. But I think particularly if people are going to an unchurched and unreached area and feel the burden of many, many souls around them on their way to hell, to get ill is devastating when you want to be reaching these people. To stop and have holidays when you know you can be with these people, speaking with them about Jesus, is really hard. And that's worth a conversation with missionaries, how they are sustaining themselves. And that's something that we try to do each year with our mission partners, just like staff have an annual review, so we have a mission partners review. And part of it is, are you being sustainable? Yes, we want you to be sacrificial, but we want you to be there for as long as you possibly can be there. We'll get to a real missionary in a minute, but two more before we get there. On the other page, linking up here and there. One thing that we have found very helpful is linking up ministry amongst particular people groups here and there. So what's particularly helped in the past, our involvement in French-speaking Europe, was French speakers here. Steve and Dawn Orange, who are in Belgium and went about 20 years ago, they helped start some of this work. Yves-Marie's father, Etienne, when she was first here 20 years ago, helped build on that work. And when he was here doing evangelistic events amongst French city businessmen, which ran very differently from how we might do it in terms of the amount of time someone speaks for and the kind of questions that you asked. But it was great to have that linkage there and to Paris as well. There was something of that linkage amongst Japanese people, which made us want to invest more amongst Japanese people by sending not just Roseanne, but also Thierry and Antonia. I can remember praying with Selvin down in the basement before the men's toilets were the men's toilets. It was the creche, and it had psychedelic carpets, and we used to pray there for Japanese businessmen very frequently, and trying to link up what was happening here with what was happening in Tokyo, not least because Japanese people do seem more open to the gospel here than they are in Japan. And then trying to link up things between Bangladeshis here and in Bangladesh. So we had a homework helper scheme, just helping volunteers to go into Bangladeshi families to help their children with their schoolwork. And we were supporting missionaries in Bangladesh who were much more proclamatory in their ministry there. We had prayer groups linked to these different groups. And I think those worked because it was linking stuff that was happening here and that people were doing with stuff that was happening there. We found it hard to have prayer groups just for what's happening over there. There was a sub-Saharan African prayer group, and I think that's always struggled to keep going. We've obviously seen mainland Chinese people come here, come to faith, grow, be trained, and sometimes stay and sometimes go back. That's grown. And it's impacted us at St Helen's, I think, on a Sunday morning at 10:30 particularly, seeing a pretty much Revelation 7 type atmosphere of multitudes from different nations in front of us. I've only heard one person complain about the changing face of St Helen's, disgruntled at these foreigners coming in and changing our sermon illustrations, and who might be at the front giving a reading or praying, which I think is wonderful. Only one person, maybe more, didn't hear them, but I think that's great that as a church we are changing and people are accepting and welcoming and loving one another. Alex is a Spanish speaker, and we are seeing Spanish speakers be reached in small ways, and we hope it might become bigger ways, and that might become the next Spanish-speaking Europe focus, who knows. But also recognizing things change, not just with positives of Spanish speakers, but our missionary in Bangladesh is no longer there, and things have morphed a bit in terms of our outreach amongst Bangladeshis, and that our French-speaking outreach isn't really going particularly well here now. And we shouldn't beat ourselves up about it. God brings and God moves, but just recognize there's a change there. And then supporting there to here to there again. So this is thinking about people that come from Kenya, hearing about our apprenticeship scheme and want to be trained here, and then head back to their own country. In many ways, I think these kinds of people probably have more ministry experience than others of our apprentices. They're not just testing the waters before either going back into secular work or going on to something else. They've probably been involved for a number of years, like Peter Muturi in Nairobi. And these are people worth supporting, encouraging here, maybe keeping for a little bit longer to embed, and then supporting as they go back to help expository centres be set up. They don't always need much money because they're supported back in their home country. And I don't think we should give them lots of money either, because it can distort their working relationships with other colleagues who are not supported from big Western churches. Usually our mission partners, when they go from here, are supported with 30% of their needs, and everything else is from individuals. But with these regional partners, we try not to give them any money at all, but much more morale support and visits and do conferences with them, like happened in Latvia, like William did recently in Bulawayo, and others have done in Nairobi and elsewhere. And I think we'd aim to reduce this support over time so that we can then invest elsewhere with our time and morale. The hard thing, I think, in all of this is oversight. How do we know what is going on the ground, and how do we know if it's any good? And it's tricky. I think that's tricky for our mission partners too, who are often pulled between their sending church, their mission agency, and people on the ground. Who is overseeing them? I'll come back to that more at the end. But I can remember, not recently, thankfully, but more than a few trips to French-speaking Europe to try to iron out, in my bad French, differences and difficulties that some of our mission partners were facing with colleagues and overseers on the ground, and what that should look like, and what expectations we had as a sending church, and what expectations the local people had of the mission partner. And the mission partner in many ways being caught in the middle of those. But it's time now to hear from a real live missionary. So Joelle, please come and join us. So many of you will know Joelle, if not by sight, maybe from the Bible Matters podcast recently. She's back here on home assignment and for a time of recuperation. ordinarily would be in Cambodia, which was not a focus area of St Helen's. But it shows God raises up, God challenges us to support other people. So, Joelle, how did you end up in Cambodia?
Yeah, so before I became a missionary, I trained as an art teacher. I went to Cambodia to teach at a Christian mission school there in Phnom Penh, and that was back in 2006. During my time there, I felt a great curiosity for the Cambodian people, and I decided instead of going to an international church, I would instead go to a local Cambodian church and try to get to know Cambodian people. Through that church, I made lots of Cambodian friends. None of them were studying the Bible during the week. They just went to church on a Sunday, and that was all. So I said, do some of you want to get together with me midweek and study the Bible? They said yes. They started bringing non-Christian friends along. Some people became Christians. And I just remember thinking, this is great. I would love to do this full time. So I came back to the UK after three years, shared that kind of thought with St Helen's, ended up doing the associate scheme and then going back as a mission partner.
So thankfully we did send you, unlike William Carey. What helps and hinders you as you serve in Cambodia?
Yeah, so it's really important to have good sending churches who care about you and who are faithful in prayer. It's really encouraging to know that your ministry is being covered in prayer by people back home. I think it really helps to be working on a team of missionaries that prioritise God's word and are on the same page theologically. That just makes life a lot easier if as a team you're on the same page theologically. So for me, that has happened. So I'm very, very thankful. So that's really helpful. I think things that have been hindering us, particularly in Cambodia at the moment, is that there's lots of Korean cults that have come into Cambodia, and they are leading astray a lot of Cambodian Christians right now. So that's been a big kind of push on the missionary front to try and teach them about false teachers and false Christianity and true Christianity. The Cambodian church is very young. 90% of the Cambodian church was killed during Pol Pot in the 70s, so it had to start from scratch again. Where I work, the gospel has only been there 20 years. So the church is very young, and they're easily led astray by cults and things like that. So that's hard work for us. Another really simple thing that hinders us is just the weather. I work in a hill tribe area, go out to remote villages. During rainy season, which lasts 4 to 5 months, those villages are cut off. And all of my ministry in those villages needs to cease up, and I can't visit them. And all I can do is pray for them that they keep going in their faith. So rainy season makes things very difficult. And then during hot season, it's in the mid-40s, and your energy is sapped, and you feel lethargic and unwell most of the time, and it's really hard to keep persevering during that time as well. Yeah.
That's quite hot. What do you wish you'd known before you went?
Yeah, so the first 2 years in Cambodia was spent learning the language, and I remember thinking, if God knew he was going to send me to Cambodia, why didn't he give me the gift of languages? Because I really am not very good at languages. So it was a hard 2 years for me, harder than I thought it was going to be. But once I did get on track with the language, I actually found that, this was another surprise for me, I actually found that teaching the Bible was easier than just doing chit-chat with people. And I think the reason for that is that, when you're doing a Bible study, you've prepared it in advance, you know what you're going to say, you know how you're going to say it. Whereas when you're just chit-chatting with people, it's very organic and you haven't planned what you're going to say, and I find chit-chat a lot harder. But teaching the Bible easier, which was a nice surprise. I think another thing that's surprised me is that I thought when I went to Cambodia, I've made this sacrifice, I've made the sacrifice of leaving church and friends and family, and once I've been there a while, it would get easier. I've made that sacrifice already and it would get easier. But I'm actually finding as the years go on and I'm getting older, sort of more sacrifices come up. I'm getting older, and because I've left everything to serve in Cambodia, I don't have a home of my own here in the UK, and I won't ever be able to buy one. So I'm just thinking, okay, what happens when I reach retirement? And so as I'm getting older, that feels like quite a sacrifice. As I've got older, I've developed some health issues, and I live in a place where there's no medical care, and medicines are 12 hours away in Phnom Penh. So things like that are feeling more like a sacrifice and harder. And then as time goes on, you start to think about parents getting older, you start to feel guilty that you're overseas, and you're kind of thinking, I'm torn by, I want to continue doing my ministry, but also family are getting older, and should I, when is the right time to go back? So it kind of requires more trust and dependence on God and just seeking his wisdom for those things, which is good because it's making you depend on God, but it's also things that aren't easy.
I was encouraged that you find Bible study in your language easier than talking, because I think that's true in Saletti as well, so that's good. How do you see partnering between us, your mission agency, OMF, and you? How do you see it working or not working?
Yeah, I think, it's biblical to have a sending church. I myself consider myself still accountable to St Helen's for the ministry that I'm doing. So I want to be having the same kind of ministry priorities as St Helen's when I'm in Cambodia. So really sort of concentrating on Bible teaching and God's word. I still consider myself under the spiritual headship of St Helen's, even when I'm in Cambodia. I think in terms of OMF, my sending agency, it's a real benefit to arrive on the field and join a team and not be there as a lone worker. That's a lot safer. And it's also nice to be with a mission agency because they know the local context, they know the country, they know the language, they know the culture, and they have great wisdom and can advise you on that local context when issues come up. It's also much easier being with a sending agency because they do a lot of the administrative work, so things like getting visas and sorting out your finances. It's just helpful that they're doing all of that paperwork and I don't need to do it, and I'm just free to get on with teaching the Bible. Yeah.
So do you think it does work, us partnering with you?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, as I've just said, I think OMF and St Helen's, they bring different things to the table and they complement each other. So St Helen's with ministry knowledge and guidance and spiritual oversight, and OMF with the overseas knowledge and guidance of the local context. Yeah.
That's encouraging because it doesn't always work. How can we better support you and others, do you think?
Yeah, I think just an easy way of remembering it is, you don't want it to be a case of out of sight, out of mind. You want your mission partners to feel remembered and not forgotten. I do feel remembered by St Helen's, so I'm really happy. A lot of missionaries that I meet on the field are not happy. They do feel forgotten by their churches and that their churches don't really pay them much attention. But in my case, I don't feel that. I think you want to be really faithful in prayer for your mission partners. St Helen's has a system of having a link person, so each missionary has a link person at St Helen's who keeps in regular contact with them. They can alert the church if there's anything serious going on the field or if there's any urgent cases for prayer. So I think having a link person is really helpful. I think videos help because it's nice for your congregation to see the face of the missionary overseas. You come back to your church and people say, oh, I feel like I know you, even though I've never met you before, because I've seen your face on video. And so I think that just makes people feel like they know you. So I think that's helpful. And I think just encourage, the people in your congregation to maybe pick a mission partner, one of the mission partners that they're going to pray for regularly and maybe just send an email to every now and again. It really lifts my spirits when I get just a short email from someone. It might only be 2 or 3 lines just saying, we prayed for you on Sunday, thinking of you, hope you're doing well. Just little things like that. Just really lift your spirits.
Well, thanks, Joelle, very much. We'll turn to prayer in a little bit, and it'd be good to include Joelle in your prayers, but do catch her afterwards to ask a bit more about what she's been doing. Thanks, Joelle. But before we do turn to pray, just some final kind of observations. It's hard to keep mission partner things high on the agenda. I think they're always on the agenda here. They're always being prayed for, always mentioned. I think it's hard to keep it high on the agenda and hard to keep it high in people's minds of thinking of going themselves, just due to everything else that's going on in people's lives. I think it's hard not to have multiple supporting churches. So we try to be the only church that sends people. Not because we want to be selfish and grabby, but because I think it works best for one church to be sending somebody. There's less confusion on the field, and one church can more easily get behind someone like that. But it's hard to do because mission is expensive. So, for example, in Japan, maybe £80,000 at least for a family. That's hard, even for St Helen's, to do on its own. It's hard to do it yourself as a church, and it's hard to work with mission agencies. We have tried sending Steve and Dawn Orange, for example, when they first went to Belgium to work for the student organisation, the GBU. We were their mission agency, big St Helens, with a back office and accountants. And it was very hard work. We just about got away with doing all the things that needed doing administratively in Belgium and for them. And I don't think we could have done it for anybody else. So it's hard to do it on your own without a sending agency, but it's also hard to do it sometimes with mission agencies. In many ways, because of the William Carey legacy, some, not your mission agency, Selwyn, some mission agencies think they are the ones doing mission. No, they are facilitating churches to do it. And so often get quite grabby of the missionary. I won't say which agencies they are, but they can be quite controlling and don't do partnership very well. So it's hard to do it yourself, but it's also hard sometimes with some mission agencies. It's hard working with diaspora churches and foreign missionaries. So working amongst Saletis in Tower Hamlets, there is a Bengali fellowship. It's quite hard working with them because they don't always like Saleti people. They're from a different part of Bangladesh. In our part of Tower Hamlets too, there are some Nigerian churches, and trying to work with them to help reach Muslim people has been hard as we try to engage together in reaching the nations. It's also hard working with foreign missionaries. The former pastor, American pastor at East London Tabernacle, Ken Brownell, said that at any one time, there are 50 American missionaries from the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention working in London, none of whom know each other or will work with any other church. He was slightly exaggerating, but only slightly. And our experience has been in Tower Hamlets and in Bangladesh is that many foreign missionaries don't like working with other people and aren't good at actually understanding what church is and being under church and working with churches. Haven't grasped Philippians' partnership. It's hard to manage from afar and have local involvement and oversight. It's hard for me to go to Paris and talk with mission partners, overseers, about what we think they may be doing right or wrong. And it's hard for those people in Paris to tell our missionary what to do. It's also been hard for us to encourage locals to take ownership at times, particularly in cultures where, so for example, in Belgium, it's very much the state supports the Catholic Church, and so churches generally, Protestant churches, have got that kind of mindset about giving, aren't giving so much, except the state. Also, they want people from outside to do it all for them. And so to help Steve and Dawn as they lead a church to have co-elders who are Belgian and people that can oversee them has been really hard to do. Also, just people are sinful, mission partners are sinful too, and can play local overseers off against St Helen's overseers as well. It's hard to cut ties. It's hard to say, actually, you're established and we think that's brilliant and we'll pray for you, but we're going to move on to do something else. Partly because often there isn't local ownership to step up, and partly we want to keep these mission partners in a way. But I saw a brilliant example of it 2 weeks ago, Marie, with your dad. So there's an American bunch of churches that have been funding the church that Etienne has been leading, and has been doing so for the last 7 years. And they've said, no, now is the time to pull away. And they've been overseeing it really helpfully for the last 7 years, not controlling, not managing. And Etienne has been contacting the different pastors of the churches that have helped fund it in a very responsible way. It was really encouraging to see that. So I think those are general hard things. I think two particular hard things that we have at St Helens, there may be more, but these were sprung to mind. I've mentioned one of them. I think it is hard for us to pioneer. I'm not sure it's totally in our DNA. Mark Dever in Washington might say it's because we all stayed here and didn't go to the colonies and become Americans and entrepreneurial and all of that. And we're very boring. He might say that. He has said that, actually. On the positive side, St Helens might change as we have people from all the nations coming here, changing us. And St Helens isn't just people like me who stay, but I think we do find it hard to pioneer. And I think it's hard for our men to go. I think we're very good at helping people to think through the 938 type question. Should I go into full-time Bible teaching? And I think we're not very prescriptive after that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We don't want to be necessarily pushing people in particular directions. But in the past, certainly, there's always been the Anglican route that people have gone to, quite a set, it's the wrong phrase, but career path, that men, they've answered the 938 question and they head to Cornhill, Oak Hill, and then wherever else after that. For women, that's much harder, has been, always harder. And so I think that's often why more women, single women, do end up overseas, because it's in their minds and on their agenda a lot earlier than it is for men. I wonder if some of the difficulties within the Anglican Church might mean more men think about it more quickly. Who knows? But staying is good as going as well. It's not second best. But I think sometimes it has been hard for our men to go. There are 3 web links there that you might find helpful. I've just subscribed to that middle one, 7 prayer requests about global needs each week. Just a short bullet point of news items around the world that I've found very helpful to pray through. And I think it's time that we should pray as well. Why not pray through Revelation 7, that would be the vision in your heart that keeps you going this week, this month, this year. Why not pray for Joelle, some of the things that she shared? And then why not pray for mission partners that you know, whichever church and congregation you're part of? And then William will draw us to a close when we need to close. Thanks very much.